here today. So I was wondering if our Fort Wallace Memorial Association Board could stand and be recognized. Let's see, and I think a couple others are maybe still in the back. Lynn Kirkham is, I don't know what to say about how hard he works as treasurer of this organization. The hundreds of thousands of dollars of grants that have come through here, the amount of money and building all this, and Lynn puts in work every day. Lynn, I appreciate all your efforts and everything you do. And then the Guardians are the fundraising arm of the board. They're underneath the board, but they're a special committee, and it overlaps some. But the Guardians of the Fort Wallace Museum are they are producing tonight's banquet and the fundraising dinner. So I would also like the members of the Guardian Committee to stand. And as I said, that is overlapping. So that's, yep, they're. Others are around busy working also. So I know Chris is back there in the back. And we actually have members raising money today at a gun show in Colby that are also working today. So there's a hard-working group. So anyway, is Stan Shook, is he within hollering distance? Stan? I can get him later. All right, that's all right. I can come back to that. Let me say right now, I hope you've taken a look through our new library and to see all the efforts that are being put on that. Nancy Arendt, who many of you know also through the Kansas Anthropological Organization, she is our new employee, and she is doing a lot of back-end work for the library. And I just greatly commend her. Grab her if you have a chance and let her show you what's going on in the library. But one thing is that we have duplicate books that are coming in, and they need a home. And so if y'all are interested in that, there is a couple of shelves of duplicate books. You can take a peruse through there. They're generally going to be $10 a piece. But it would be very well if those could get a home and be taken care of and enjoyed. So take a look at that, and I think Nancy can show you where those used books are. So I think that's all for now. I think we'll make some more announcements following Mr. Berry's presentation. So without further ado, I would like to present Mr. Mark Berry. He's going to talk on sign language. He is from McDonald, Kansas. He is such an experienced and wonderful historian here in our local area, a longtime reenactor and a really great friend. This is Mr. Mark Berry.
Thanks, Jane. Being we're talking about communication, and we're going to start out. What if everybody in this room spoke a different language? There's about 75, 80 of us probably here today. What if everybody spoke a different language? How would we communicate? We've been communicating all morning, and everybody's been having a great time, and we understand what the speaker's saying, and we can add comments and all that. But what if each and every one of us couldn't understand and spoke a different language? Well, can't hear me in the back yet. So, the title of my presentation, I guess you might call it, is the Lingua Franca of today, or the plains, or the time. So we get this term from the Middle Ages, when we had the Crusades, and we had people of Europe going to the Levant, and of course, they couldn't talk to the people in the Levant, and the Levant couldn't talk to them. So eventually, over time, actually fairly shortly, a sort of shorthand language developed that was part Franc, which was the French, and part German, and a lot of Latin, some Hebrew, some Turkish, Syrian, that type of thing. And pretty soon they had developed what we'd call now maybe a pig den language that allowed them to, conduct trade and to communicate with each other. Well, that's always been a problem with people when you get people of different languages and different nationalities and different races together, the communication. China, during the 1890s, when the English were there, they also developed a Franca Lingua of types, but it was more of a pig den China, hey boy and chop chop and that type of thing. And then, of course, in Africa, when we had the Dutch and English down in Africa, we had Swahili develop it. It was different languages. America was quite a bit different. Although we were settled again by Europeans, and we had French and Spanish and English here, we also had the native population. At one time, in North America, just North America itself, we believe that there were over between 60 and 70 root languages. And of that, there were 300 dialects. And we have large groups of large tribes, we have little tribes, we have tribes that, there might only been maybe less than 1,000 people in. We have tribes, that were on the eastern coast, lots and lots of people. Now, we never developed Franca Lingua here. And nowadays you might say, well, Tex-Mex or the Cajuns, which is a blend. But back then, it was a whole lot easier to go with a system that we found here. It wasn't anything we introduced. It was a system that the Indians, or the native population, had been using for who knows how long. So, just to document that a little bit, we have instances. Columbus mentions the use of sign language. Cabrillo, when he got to San Diego Bay in 1542, mentions the use of sign language. Coronado, of course, when he came up through the plains here in 1540s, he mentions the use of sign language. Caballero de Vasca, who spent 8 years wandering through the wilderness along the southern coast, said that he could talk to any tribe that he met by using sign language. John Smith, on our eastern starboard, he mentions the use of sign language among those Indians. So it wasn't necessarily just in the plains, it was all over. Long, when he came through this area in 1820, 1819, he mentions the use of sign language. In fact, eventually he put out a paper, it was put out in the 1830s, and he had listed about 100 signs or so. Ruxton, when he visited the great American plains and mountains to see what the mountain men were doing, what the Indians were doing, he mentions the use of sign language. Fremont, in the 1840s, mentions the use of sign language, even in the intermountain desert regions where the Digger Indians and those were, where we really don't think of them, being out meeting other tribes or anything like that. They use sign language to a certain degree. And then, of course, we have Captain Marcy, who put out the Prairie Traveler, who was all over this part of the world in the early 1840s and 50s and 60s. He mentions in his Prairie Traveler the use of sign language. Same way with Colonel Richard Dodge, who was out here during the 60s and 70s and 80s. So even Custer, our own George Custer, mentions the use of sign language. And George the general was a great lover of anything that was Indian. When he was on his route through Kansas and into Nebraska in 1867, he spent a tremendous amount of time with Comstock and the Pawnee and the Osage Scouts trying to learn the Indian way. He had them do dances for him. He studied the burial sites, and he tried to pick up some sign language, and so he mentions it in his book, Life on the Plains. So, sign talk became the lingua franca of the explorers, the scouts, the mountain men, the Indian traders, and the interpreters. They all knew sign. In fact, it's mentioned that you could take a complete greenhorn, somebody that had never been there, never seen an Indian before, and put him in an Indian camp, and within 2 weeks or less, if he had any intelligence at all, he could be speaking to these people through sign language. It's picked up fairly rapidly. It's not that hard to learn. We're learning the language, especially something as problematic as Arapaho, which has a lot of guttural clicks and pauses and things, or Sioux, which sounds more like German than any other Indian language. But it's real simple. You just learn to talk with your hands very quickly. And it wasn't very hard either. In fact, the old mountain men had a term that they called the Indian women sleeping dictionaries. If you spent any time in a camp, did any cohabitation with any Indian women, you would have learned almost immediately sign language and eventually, possibly, their spoken language. There's one instance that was put out where a Frenchman had married or taken up with I think she was Shoshone, I don't remember. But anyway, in the 2 years that he lived with her, he never learned her language, and she didn't learn his, but they were perfectly content with sign language. Had no they could talk to each other very easily with sign language. No need to learn that. Most of the scouts, we talked this morning about Comstock. Well, I'm sure he knew sign language. I imagine he knew Cheyenne. He'd spent time in Cheyenne and Sioux camps. Sharp Grover, we know from the accounts of Beecher's Island, was able to communicate with the Indians, that were attacking him. And he probably used some sign, but he could speak their language. And it said that he had a Sioux wife, so more likely he could speak. But I'm sure he could do sign. And of course, the civilized Indians that we used as scouts, such as the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Osage, the Pawnee, all of those people were definitely sign talkers. Because, a Pawnee doesn't readily be able to talk to a Kiowa or whatever, but he can use sign language. And it would also be fairly convenient. We were talking about the telegraph, how earlier this morning, how, we could send messages back and forth. Well, just think how nice it would be that if the officers, the soldiers, could speak sign language. Would cut down way far on a lot of the disagreements. But communication between two peoples is not only just being able to talk, but you have to understand their thought process and where they're coming from. And I'm talking about telegraph there a little bit earlier. Captain Randolph Marcy had been to the West Coast and was on his way back. And he was in Texas, and he had a Delaware scout with him who Marcy said was a real cosmopolitan. He could talk to about anybody, and he was just a great scout. Well, they were talking to some Comanches there in Texas, and this is 1849, 1850, and we have Captain Marcy wanting to tell the Indians all about the miracles of the telegraph, how we could communicate over great distances through a piece of wire with some clicks and clacks, and it was just a wonderful newfound science. And he turned to Big Beaver, the Delaware scout, and he says, why don't you explain that to the Comanches? And Big Beaver turns around and he says, I don't think I'll be able to tell him that, Captain. And for the truth is, I don't believe it myself. So there you have that cultural divide there. Even though Big Beaver could tell big whoopers and everything like that as an Indian, he did not believe that we could click-clack on a piece of wire and talk to people. Yeah. Another instance where our communications really foul up because we have a poor interpreter and we have an officer who doesn't know anything, and we talked a little bit about that this morning, was the Grattan incident. Now, 1851, the Sioux in that area had signed a treaty up in Fort Laramie that was allowed the immigrants to go through their area, and the Sioux said that, if we cause any damage or anything happens, why, we're liable and we'll try to pay for it, or at least, So as it turns out, some Mormons one day weren't watching their cows real well, and one of the cows wandered off. And a Minjaconju, Sioux Indian, absconded with the cow and had her for breakfast. Well, there was a Brule chief who witnessed this act and worried about it would bring down problems on his tribe. He went to the fort and said, hey guys, this stupid Minneconja just killed a Mormon cow, and if anybody needs to own up to it, it's that guy. It's not me. I was a good guy. Well, as we said this morning, lack of communications, and the powers that be finally decided we'd better go check it out. So a second lieutenant, Lieutenant Grattan, who had earlier said that giving him 30 men, he could wipe out the whole Cheyenne nation. He didn't like Indians. So he and his men and 2 12-pound howitzers and 1 Augustus Lucian scout interpreter who was drunker than a skunk and hated Indians with a passion, trotted out to the Brule camp, not the Minneconju camp, but the Brule camp. And the poor Indian that had reported the problem by the name of Bear, he comes out with his lodge and everything. And so we get into a heated discussion. And the drunken Frenchman says, if you don't wise up, they're going to cut out your hearts and eat them raw. Well, guess what happened? People started shooting. The soldiers run back, fire the cannon off. Nobody taking time to aim it, and all they did was knock a few poles off the top of the teepees. And then they turned and ran, and all 30 of those soldiers were massacred. Now, if somebody had been able to communicate between the parties, and if somebody hadn't had a cultural bias, should have never happened. But that's, again, communication and the lack of it by a poor scout and a poor military commander. Now, that kind of set the stage for the whole rest of the Indian Wars. I mean, how many times can we count that battles, people were killed, all because of miscommunication? Sand Creek Massacre should never have happened. And from that developed untold amounts of misery and more warfare. And we can run down the line through the 1857 Cheyenne expedition. Again, mismanagement, misunderstanding. Our own Hancock expedition that came through here, same difference. The Red River Wars. And we can go on down and down the line until we get to the Ghost Dance, where again, this morning we had a real good telling of that story, how that was all miscommunications. We had an Indian agent that didn't understand Indians, couldn't talk to them, and he eventually created a situation that led to a massacre. So, we've got to work on our communication skills. Now let me talk, that was my introduction. Now we'll do a little sign language, hopefully. I can remember enough to stumble through this. Sign language is not hard to learn, fairly easy if you've got any kind of memory at all. And mine's getting more short-term all the time. But unless you practice it and use it, it's just a exercise in futility. And I was fairly proficient at one time, and then pretty soon I forget it, and then I come back to it and I try it again. And it's unless you've got someone with you that you can sign talk all the time, it's a skill that needs development. To join the American Mountain Men, nowadays you've got to learn, I think, at least 50 signs and be able to use them. And I never joined, but at one time I could have done that. Now, first off, sign language, one of the books we use for reference is Garrick Mallory, and he goes into a big, long discussion about the development of sign language, how it would have came about. In fact, actually begins with the question, if you can't talk, can you think? And of course, that's always kind of like the chicken and the egg business, if you can't organize your thoughts through language, it's awful hard unless just using instinct that your thoughts develop. So, was the first language vocal or was it sign language? Did they come at the same time, where using the signs helped develop the speech? And so, they were, this is the 1870s, remember, and everybody was a Renaissance man, interested in everything and studied everything. And so these types of questions were asked, and people knocked them around and that kind of thing. But, and then some people would say that there's no language at all without hands, like Marla back there, moving her hands around. And we're all like that, they say, well, the Italians, and they still use sign language to a great degree. English-speaking people's English, we're also stated superior and everything. We don't use our hands much. But we wink and we frown and we sigh, and so we still use hands and that type of thing with our language. In fact, one of the theories that Mallory said, it was a thing that was said, that jokes came with the candle. In other words, if you're sitting someplace and somebody's telling a joke and you can't see his face or his hand actions, the joke has a lot to be desired. You might catch the joke, but you're not in with the feeling, the hilarity, that type of thing. So he says, without hands, without light, you couldn't tell a joke, which, who knows? Some of the guys that studied the sign language in the Indians claimed that their vocabulary was so limited that they had to expand it with their hands. Well, we all know that's wrong, just the old saying about Alaskans, having 20 different names for snow. The Indians and the things they were interested in, they had plenty of words to convey any idea. In fact, Mallory tells of one time where one of the chiefs, I don't remember which tribe or anything else, it's just off the top of my head, but anyway, he was in Washington and had attended this treaty meeting and everything. He comes back to his delegation, his people, and Mallory says he talked for 2.5 hours on his feelings and what the treaty was like and everything else. He says, if you have a limited vocabulary, he says, you're not going to be able to talk for 2.5 hours on that one treaty. He said, the Indians had plenty of words, could speak well. So sign language was just a way they developed to intertribal, to conduct speech with their hands to someone that could not speak their language. Sign is a pantomime language. This is bird. That's not real hard to see that that's a bird. That's a pantomime. Signs did change over time, and we get the line that, well, the signs were universal, but, they changed over time. Well, actually, the signs were not universal. They did change and develop over the years, but they were universally used. So in other words, sign for today, like coffee, which began with, you had the beans and you roasted them on a fire and then you ground them and then you put them in a pot and then you put it on the fire and all that developed immediately into one sign when this implement became prevalent on the plains, and that's the coffee mill. So instead of going through the whole pantomime of making a cup of coffee, you simply, everybody realized that's what you're doing. You're making coffee. The same way with weapons. At first you had the bow and arrow, and the signs for that. And eventually, of course, you had the muzzle loading rifles where you load and you shoot. And then eventually it went down to bang, bang with 6 shots, So, they changed as they evolved and picked up more different things. But, they did use signs pretty much basic. Now, they varied from tribe to tribe where they came from. Ben Clark, who was an interpreter and scout, married to a Cheyenne woman down on the reservations in Oklahoma, down at Darlington. He said that the Cheyenne believed that the Kiowa had invented the sign language. And several other tribes also said that the Kiowa could have invented the sign language. Well, Kiowa are a special people. They're a completely isolated language group. They're not related to anybody that we know of. And here they are in the middle, down here between the Comanche and the Arapaho and the Apache and the Cheyenne. And so naturally, to talk to all these people, and none of their words made any sense to anybody, why they became very proficient. And there was a theory that maybe they picked that sign language up when they went to Mexico. Well, we've discounted the Mexican connection. It's strictly an Indian thing. But we don't know who invented it, but the tribe said that the Kiowa did. I don't really think that's the way it went, but that's where they thought it come from. So to begin with, we'll do a few signs, and I'll see what I can talk about for just a little bit. And we'll start out with probably the most important sign is your interrogative. This is a question of who, when, where, why, how. And you start it out, it's real simple. You get your hand up here and you wiggle your hand. So, if I want to ask a question, I start out the sentence with this. And a real simple section could be, question, you, what's your name? Real simple. This is talk, pointed at you, and that says, what is your name? If you wanted to say, question, where we, which you're going to go, all go with me. The question, will you go with me? And if you wanted to say, you'd say, question, where? And so, we've got a conversation started already, but we've used this interrogation sign. We use that a lot. Now, there's no small words like or and or but anything like that. The, none of those small words. It's just idea after idea. Time is counted like this is the present. This is the past, and this is the future. It's the way time is. Now we can get into daybreak, sunrise, the day opens up for today. If we want to talk about yesterday, we can do that same sign at sunrise. Yesterday, I did such and such. That's time. Length of time, a day was counted as sleeps or nighttime. A month would be a moon. This is the moon of crows. Last month was the hungry moon. If any of you got cows or animals, you know exactly what I mean, because by February, everybody's burned up all their excess fat, and they're all hungry, and they can't get enough to eat. So February is the hungry moon, and this moon is the crow. Moon of the crows, blackbird. Okay, years are done with winters. And the sign for winter is you've got your robe and you've wrapped it around you. And so if somebody asks you how old you are, you say, well, I'm 50 winters or I'm 10 winters or whatever. You know, it's counted as winters, not years. It's winters. Okay. Another major difference is that Indians think with their heart, not their head. So the heart. So something that is good comes from your heart. Something that is strong. If you've got a strong heart, why, you're a brave person. So it comes from your heart. Now, it's a skeleton language. You start out with basic ideas and you keep building onto that. So, we take a simple sign, one that would have been used an awful lot, and that's this one, and that means to trade or buy or purchase, or what do you have to trade? So, I've got the sign for trade. Now, if I want to add to that, say, like this is together, that would be a marriage. Trade for a marriage. If I add trade and hair, which is feminine, female, I have a wife. Trade, a wife. If I add the possession to that, this is a sign for possession. It's a lot like drink, but it goes like that. That means my wife. And if I wanted to say that my wife is beautiful, I would do this, and then I would say she's good. Beautiful, good. Now, if I wanted to say, all through those signs, that I love my wife, I would go like that, and, that's love. Add another emotion, you could have, I don't like my wife, define her. In fact, if I don't like her so much, I'm going to divorce her or push her away. If I wanted to add more to that, I could add in a child. I could add in a crazy mother-in-law. So, with just those few signs, I'm well on my way to the Harlequin romance of the month. I can just keep adding there, and she's got a lover. You just keep building on to that vision, and you can do that with about anything. You've got basic signs. I've done this one several times and hadn't explained it, but this is nighttime, and you see the shadow of this hand is crossing this hand. And so it's getting dark. So this is darkness or night. And as I said, daybreak, and the sun is a circle. And so you can start out with sun on the horizon and do the whole part of the day, noon and evening and daybreak. When you get up, well, the day is unfolding like a book. Let's see, have my thoughts here together a little more. This is a sign, this is the present sign. This is a sign for now. Mildred Joy's given that to me. When we're someplace and I'm involved talking to somebody and it's getting dark outside and everybody else has left and I'm still jabbering away, goofing off, and she'll come by and she'll say, "Go now." And I go, "Okay, I got the sign, Mom. It's time for us to go home." But this is the present. This is go now. Let's see if I can think of any. This we were doing relationships. This is father. This side is father. This side is mother. This is friend. Sign for friend. And if you have a brother, you take your friend sign, put it to your lips, and then you say, "He's a brother." This is a sign for male. Now, if it's a sister, you would do that, and then draw your fingers to your hair, that, it's a sister. And if you want to denote age, a man, say my brother, and, he's not equal to me. He's maybe a teenager, or maybe he's younger. If it's a sister, you go like this, rather than the upright man sign. But you denote height and age by that. One I get a lot of anymore is this sign here. That's old. That's an old man with a walking staff, He's old. That's the sign for old. Let's see. Think of something else that's good. As I said, they think from their heart, and so anything from the heart out like that is good. Something that's bad, you throw it away. It's no good. Throw it away. So we can slip for that something that tastes good or it tastes bad. We throw it away. There's a story in my family where great-grandma they were homesteading around Hayes, and Indians came through and wanted some potatoes. And so she said, "Okay." This is the 1880s. And they went through and dug every potato up, but only kept the good ones. They threw away the bad ones. And of course, great-grandma, that's what she lived on, so she had to go back out there and collect all the bad potatoes. But, bad potatoes. With two hands, that means abandon or divorce or several other signs like that. It's the same sign as this, but, it's more emphasis to get rid of it, to throw it away. So, if I did the sign like this, that means I'm undecided. The line I always like to use is maybe so, or perhaps, I really don't know, maybe so, good or bad, good or bad. Let's see, on that type of thing. When you're just wanting to denote heart, say like you're happy, you could say, "My heart is full of," and we'll do this, "sunshine." So I'm really happy. My heart's full, happy. if I was feeling bad, well, my heart's bad. Kind of similar to that, sign here that comes down on your head is hot. The sun is shining on your head and it's hot. If you put your hands like this and bring them down, those are clouds and can mean either good or bad, cloudy day or whatever. There's hardly anything that you can't, if you think hard enough, can't really describe with your hands. If you get back, like I said, the birds, well, that's real simple. Color, Indians had one sign for one color, and that was red, and that's your cheek. All other colors, you had to first grind it, and then you would point at it. Like if I wanted to do red, or blue, I would grind it and then point at something blue. If I wanted to do green, I would point at something green. But one sign for red. For some reason, they had distinguished red from all the other colors. That was their cheek. Let's see. If I can think of anything else right off the top of my head. That's kind of hard standing up here. Like I said, I don't do it a lot, and I've forgotten a lot.
Mark, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
So, let's say when, like Comstock and Grover go see Chief Turkey Leg, how are they gonna have a conversation? What are they gonna talk about? They're trying to find out if they're gonna be hostile. How would that go?
Well, when they went into camp, there was, they were looking for some renegades or Indians that had maybe committed some crimes, and we were trying to find those people. So you would go in and simply start out with your question. And your question, have you seen? And then you would get into bad, what would I do? Bad people. Well, bad, and then you'd say not all, but a few people that were fighting the soldiers. And it would develop on from there, however involved you wanted to get, because he's going to say no, no, I hadn't seen him, no see. And then you could get into, well, who's telling who stories, who's lying, and that type of thing. But you can actually talk, if you know what you're doing and are good at it, you can actually talk faster in sign than what you can with language, especially if there's any problem understanding any of the language. Let's see, when we go, if you're going and you're going under, this is actually the sign for death. I'm dying because it's one person and he went under. The old sign of went under, the old saying, or he rubbed them out. This actual sign for kill is like this on this side. But if you're trying to go someplace and you can't get there, it's be like you go and you run into something hard. I couldn't get there. Wasn't any way I could get there. If I want to say I arrived there, you point this out and say I arrived over there, or I arrived here. And you could say I arrived here 2 sleeps ago. So I wasn't one of the bad guys, I was here. Here is actually the term for set, and it's like this. You're setting, or I'm here, I'm present, I'm setting. A lot of the rest of it is pantomime. Animals. There's in our he has some deaf people talking to some Indians, sign language. And for the most part, they can understand each other. But the deaf people say squirrel. And to say squirrel, they go, well, he's this long and he's got a bushy tail and he eats like this and has, and it just, Indians had no idea. None whatsoever, because out here we don't have squirrels. So they didn't know what they were talking about. Same way goes with pigs. When the Indians were first introduced to bacon, well, this is terrible meat. We don't like it. It's too salty, but what kind of animal does it come from? Well, when people started to try to describe a pig to an Indian, there's no way that they could come up with a visual picture of a pig. They had never seen an animal with a round, long nose that had a curly tail. They'd never, and it had, cloven feet, and they'd never seen a pig. So they, bad meat, and we don't like it, and, we don't like pig. Flour is real similar to what we do when we do money, green. Indians would do this to mean flour. And if they meant bread, they would do flour, and then they would go like this, like patting out the flour into cakes. Let me get my book out here just to go. This is the book I've used for years. You see, it's about wore out, but it's a good one. It was published by a man by the name of Tompkins, and he spent the late 80s, early 90s out in Dakota as a young man on the ranches and stuff, and knew a lot of Indians and was really interested. And he produced a little volume, more for children, scouts, that type of thing. And this is the one we all use. And you can see he's got, probably real hard to see, but he's got little drawings in there of different signs. And the Indians counted to 10 just like we do, only they started out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Counted that way rather than the way we do it. And a lot of them you can put like a sign for afraid. And this is kind of an old cowboy saying, well, he pulled in his horns. And that's what the Indians were saying. He pulled in his horns. He was afraid. He backed off. And so that's a sign for afraid. The sign for take is like this. And like this means to steal, because you're doing it under the shade of darkness or whatever. You're taking, you're stealing. And then of course I did fights like this. And soldiers is like this, which is just a representation of a line of soldiers. We've got, and of course, like plenty, heaps a bunch of heaps. If you're sick, you're like this. If you're starving to death, you're like this. You're down to the ribs. If you're hungry, it's like this. If you eat and you're full, you're full up to here, I can't eat anymore. Water and drink are the same sign, and you're taking it like that. Talk, like I'm doing right now, is like this. Talk between Jane and I would be like this. And if I had a secret to tell Jane, it would be under darkness again, and I would talk to her that way. So there's very, very few things you can't say. And with that, I think they also had, beings were out here on the plains, and you can see great distances. They also had signals and signs that they did a horseback or on foot with a blanket. You could pull up a blanket and drop it, and that meant, that maybe there's buffalo over the hill. If the Indian rides up on the top of the hill and he gobbles back and forth, why, that means that there's buffalo. If he rides in a circle, that means danger, and you should get used to it and, get prepared for it and congregate your people into a circle. If you're a friend and you see another Indian out there, and you would ride your horse up a little ways and then back him up, or turn around and ride backwards a little bit and then come back up 2 or 3 times to be a hesitant approach, and they would know that means you're a friend. And the old movie thing, how, well, that usually means, I'm unarmed, I'm friendly, how. And if you're a long ways away and they can't see you, you can hold up both hands and does the same thing. I'm unarmed and friendly. The old-time mountain men used to just pull out their rifle. Remember, the rifles would be single shot, and fire their rifle into the air, and then go ahead and meet the party. And everybody would say, well, they all fired their rifles off, so they're not going to cause us any harm. And so then you would get together and talk. But same way with smoke signals, straight stream of smoke going up, uninterrupted, usually just more or less to get your attention. I want you to hear this. Be aware that things are going on, but, pay attention. With two smokes, well, that means everything's fine, and, come to camp. 3 smokes is, well, we're in big trouble, do whatever defensive action you can. You could do that with a blanket too. When they got ready to go into camp, the leader or whoever chose the campsite would put his blanket on a pole, maybe a spear or whatever, and hold it up in the air. And that was a signal for everybody. Yeah, oh boy, the camp's just over the rise, and we're going to camp. Now, let me tell this little story, and then I'll talk a little bit about the books that we've done. Yeah, Deb will like this one. One of her favorite people was involved in this. This is the 1857 Cheyenne expedition. And to give you just a little bit of background, after the Grattan Massacre and several other things, the government had finally decided we're going to chastise these Cheyenne people. And so they sent out a force along the Arkansas, the Santa Fe Trail, and then we also come in on the Platte, and we met and came out into here and had a battle on the Solomon up there by Hoxie, up in that area someplace. Now, this was new French cavalry. It was the first cavalry, and they were armed with a variety of oddball weapons, a lot of them experimental. And they had gotten word out along the Front Range that the Cheyenne were supposed to be out in here, so they marched out in here. We finally located the Indians. The Indians had been having a grand party. They knew the soldiers were coming, and they were going to really whoop up on them because a medicine man by the name of Ice, and we see his name over and over and over again. I think he was even involved in the Red River Wars. He was called Ice because he could walk up to you and spit hailstones at you. Now, how he accomplished that, I don't know. He was magic. Anyway, he had convinced everybody there that if they went out to this little pond that he'd blessed and they let themselves down, they would be immune to bullets. They couldn't be hurt by bullets. So, they're ready to fight. And they pick their spot. They're on this side, the Solomon's here, they're on this side. And the cavalry comes down through a canyon, and their horses are tired by the time they get there. But anyway, we all line up in a line. One of the few times where we see this, where Indians are in a line and soldiers are in a line, and we're going to have a battle. Well, the commander, by the name of Sumner, instead of what everybody expected, all of the soldiers expected, and the Indians expected, was to halt the cavalry and have them fire around at the Indians. And then, of course, the Indians figured, well, they'd be out of bullets, and bullets won't hurt us, and then we can just really mop up on them. Well, instead of doing that, he puts his horses into a trot, hollers, draw sabers, and everybody drew their saber, and he hollered, charge. And the Indians are all sitting there looking at the sabers going, this wasn't what we had planned. This is not going to work. And so they took off. And the soldiers took off after them. And the creek, the Solomon, at that time was boggy, and everybody was having a terrible time getting across it. And it became just a general free-for-all. And everybody was chasing everybody. And this is where Deb's buddy gets shot in the chest and almost dies, Jeb Stuart. But the neat little story I want to tell involves Private Roland M. Taylor. He was E Company, 1st Cav. When he got to the creek, pretty much by himself, everybody was trying to cross the creek, well, he had trouble getting his horse through. A lot of guys were abandoning their horses, but he was able to get his horse across the creek. Once he gets on the other side and gets all straightened out, he sees a lone Indian on foot going up the hill out of the creek bank. He charges after the Indian and draws his revolver. Well, before he can get to the Indian, his horse steps in a hole and falls and throws him, and his revolver is flying off into the bushes. He's still got his saber because it's tied to his wrist with a saber knot. He gets up, looks at his horse has got a broken leg. His pistol is gone, but he's got his saber. So he starts toward the Indian. Well, the Indian sees him coming, turns and starts shooting arrows at him. Well, he gets one arrow through his sleeve, and one arrow through his collar, and one arrow hits him right square in the forehead and slides off his forehead, parts his scalp, and then comes out through his hat. He was wearing a Hardy hat, which is a big black wide-brimmed hat. Well, that kind of slows him down, and he's looking around, and there is a carbine that some other trooper had left, lost, and he grabs that up, realizes it's unloaded, and so he heaves it at the Indian. Well, the Indian, no dummy, he just sidesteps and it goes plunk, and the Indian picks it up, and he throws it at Private Taylor. Well, they both miss. So now Private Taylor's got his saber, Indian's out of arrows, so it's hand-to-hand combat. Private Taylor is wailing away with his sword at the Indian. The Indian's blocking the blows with his bow. Well, this goes on for some time. They're both getting terribly tired, and no end to this battle in sight that Taylor can see. Finally, the Indian falters a little bit. His bow's just about chopped to pieces. Taylor gets a lucky blow and hits the Indian's right shoulder, and it started bleeding really bad. The Indian puts his knife, and his bow's all beat up, in his left hand, continues the battle, and in fact, at one time, Taylor makes a slice, and the Indian grabs his saber and really slices up his hand, but is not able to drag the saber away from him, because one, it's tied to his wrist. So, but the Indian's getting tireder and tireder, losing more blood all the time. And eventually, Taylor decides, now's my chance. And so he makes a lunge at the Indian. The Indian backs up and falls down on his back. Taylor immediately jumps up and runs the saber right through him. And then he's sitting there going, whoof. He's tired out. He's got the Indian pinned to the ground with his saber. The Indian's dying. And he sits down on top of the Indian. Now, here's where the good part of the story comes in. The Indian looks at Taylor and says, in sign, you take scalp. And Taylor, the upright American way soldier, says, no. Indian smiles and dies. So we have a communication in the last moments of the Indian's life with this soldier who they've just spent a hand-to-hand combat for several minutes. And the Indian asked him in sign, "Are you going to take my scalp?" And he assures the Indian he won't. And so the Indian dies happy on his way up the Milky Way to the happy hunting ground. A few minutes later, a Pawnee scout comes riding up, wanting real badly to have this Cheyenne scalp. And Taylor says, "No." He says, "I gave my word," and runs the scout off. And as far as we know, the Indian remains unscalped. So here we have a Cheyenne Indian and probably a green recruit. Most of these were made up of, green soldiers, but they were able to communicate under these circumstances through signs. And while it's not a happy ending, it's at least kind of an interesting ending. Now, talk just a minute about one of the reasons we know so much about sign language is, one, like Tompkins, we've had people that, had lived with the Indians and had written books. The two major books that were this one here was put out in 1881, and it really wasn't in book form. It was part of the annual report of the Ethnological Department of the Smithsonian. Now, the writer of the book is Garrick Mallory, lived from 1831 to 1894. He graduated Yale in 1850. He also graduated from law school and was a working lawyer. During the Civil War, he was a first lieutenant of the 71st Pennsylvania Infantry. In '62, he was wounded, left on the battlefield, and was eventually recovered from the battlefield and put in Libby Prison. He was exchanged shortly after that. And after he recovered from his wounds in 1863, he was a lieutenant colonel in the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry. When the Union forces took over Virginia, he was the judge advocate general in Virginia. He was, in 1866, he was mustered out and immediately turned around and re-enlisted with the United States military, the 43rd Infantry, and he was brevetted several times, ended up, lieutenant colonel and what was that. And to get to the interesting part, by 1870, he was part of the Signal Corps. Remember the Signal Corps we talked about this morning? Well, he was part of that. And while he was part of that, he also toured the West with John Wesley Powell. And you remember John Wesley Powell, he took a grand excursion through the far west, the Rocky Mountains and everything, recorded it, did a survey, took pictures, really a fantastic deal. Well, Garrick Mallory was with him. And when he retired, due to his wounds and everything else, Powell, who was also part of the Smithsonian, was the Ethnological Department, got Garrick Mallory to come on board. For the first annual report, he did this booklet. It goes from, page 2 something to page 500 something. And it's got some illustrations, but it has a pretty good vocabulary and lots of theory on how this developed. This is really an important work, and until Dover Press reprinted it here in the last 20 years or so, it was almost unattainable. I suppose if you went to the Smithsonian, you could have got a copy, but it was hard to get. Coming right on the heels of that is this one, Indian Sign Language by Clark. And interesting thing about this is W.P. Clark was a second lieutenant. He graduated West Point in '68. He missed the Civil War. He was a second lieutenant in the 2nd Cavalry. He was in the Dakotas, and he was also on the staff of General Sheridan. General Sheridan requested a dictionary of sign for the officers to study so they could be conversant in sign. Also to give to, they were Department of Indian Affairs at the time, they could also give it to, Indian agents and all of that type of thing. So Clark produced this, and there's no illustrations, but there's hundreds of signs in here. And the sad thing about Clark was that he died before the book was published, died at age 39. He was one of those young officers, that was a Renaissance man and a scholar and all of that type of thing. So this is a very, very important book. As I said, this one came out in the 30s and has been reprinted several times. And then nowadays we have, here's one from Iron Eyes Cody. Here's one from Franval and Dubois. This one came out in the 70s, and it's illustrated with color pictures. It's not very complete, but it's not bad. And this one came out in the 50s and 1950s, again made for probably Boy Scouts or something. And it is illustrated with drawings and fairly good work. So if you're interested at all, we're lucky to have these reprinted manuscripts from the 1880s that give you an insight into what these officers were like, the life they lived, or the things they thought about. I mean, talk about vocabulary, people nowadays can hardly talk compared to what those people could say and talk about. So, with that, I don't know how we're running on time, but if there's any questions, I'm sorry I didn't give you a few more signs. It's awful hard to just stand here and think of signs. But if you have any questions, why?
Mark, I've got another question. When, one of the things, especially if I'm talking to school groups, and I talk about the scouts, because like I mentioned this morning, the scouts are very well paid for their skill set. And you've got, scouts who know, smattering of a bunch of languages, maybe French and Spanish and Plains tribal languages. I think Clark's book may go to what I was gonna ask. Was there any kind of training? Because as far as I know, Comstock, Cody, Hickok, theirs is the language and the skills they acquired living and doing their jobs. Did they ever do any kind of training?
I don't know. I've never run across where they did do any actual classroom work. They might have, but I don't know whether they did or not. Now, like Mallory there, he was in the Dakotas with the Signal Corps and everything, and evidently he was a fairly proficient sign talker. He'd learned it on his own, and his own interest and everything. And I'm sure there were other military people that knew sign, but I don't know that by 1880, the Indian Wars are only going to last for a few more years. The Apache Wars would be over, by 1889, Ghost Dance, all of that. So there's only less than a decade left of the Indian Wars. And, the way the Army works and the way money's appropriated, I doubt that they might have, but I doubt it. I think if they were going to become proficient in Indian language, they had, and you've got this whole cultural thing, where as white, and especially educated white, why the Indians were no more than barbarians, savages, and that, you couldn't learn anything from them anyway because they were just, one step or so away from an animal. And so I really, I don't know. Like Bearcoat Miles and a few of those other officers actually had empathy for the Indians, and I'm sure tried to learn some of their mindset. But they were under orders to make the Indians comply to, whatever, stay on the reservation, don't go hunting, and become model little white people. And so I don't think that any other questions anybody has? like I said, the people that are really good at sign language can just jabber away. I've got a friend that can just jabber away all afternoon. And you gotta watch him because he'll make signs up, when he doesn't know, which is probably what the Indians did too. And, you don't always need, the Indians had developed a shorthand also, if you're wearing a blanket, you've got it wrapped around your shoulders. If you start flocking around with both hands, your blanket's gonna fall off. So, they got it like this, and so they're doing all their signs with probably one hand and a shorthand to boot. And so unless you really know if you get in on the conversation and know where it's going, it's just like with language, you can hear part of a conversation and you get the gist of what's going on. Well, the same way here, if you understand that he's talking about what he's talking about, why, you can pick up his shorthand signs. And then you've also got individual differences, just like some people talk slow and some people talk loud, some people talk with a southern accent, and some people talk like, us hillbilly West Kansas people. And, same way with your hands, you're gonna speed up, slow down, whatever. And so, not everybody, I'm sure there were differences in words and the way things were said, even among bands, like 25 people. I'm sure there was somebody that was probably real proficient and there was somebody that, wasn't. So,
I remember watching an interview with Robert Duvall, and when they were getting ready for Lonesome Dove, he went down on the border and spent time on the U.S.-Mexican border, and he said he noticed people in border towns, this is mainly bars, but he said they talk with their hands. So when you've got people speaking different languages, he said it was natural for them to
yeah.
use hands and to illustrate their words or emphasize them with the hand movements. So that's how he played Gus.
Mm-hmm.
He would emphasize those words with his hand movements.
Yeah.
Real interesting.
Yeah. There's a cultural difference, that, Indians would point with their chin. And when you're using sign language, sometimes you point at things, especially like colors or things or people. But for the most part, you're going to point with your thumb. It's kind of a insult to point with your finger. And other cultures are that way too. You don't point with your finger. And you don't make direct eye contact and all of that type of thing. You try talking to an Indian woman and you're a male, and especially if you're like me, whiter than white male, she's not going to look you in the eye. She's not going to look you in the eye and talk to you. She's going to look down and around and like that. And it's just a cultural difference that comes between people. Any other questions? If not, I've probably ran over my time, or maybe I'm quitting too early, but it doesn't really matter. We've got all afternoon, don't we? What I did with, here we go.
So Mark, stay right here. We have a second presentation here.
Oh.
We would like to also, on behalf of DK Clark, make a presentation. Can we hold that?
Right on up here, young man. Okay. Mark, it's a very interesting presentation you've given us. You've spent years and years on studying the life of the Scout. You've portrayed in living history many roles as the life of the Scout. And you epitomize by your work the inspiration and the information informing and preserving of the history, as Dennis has indicated that we need to appreciate. And by your so doing, you are being awarded the Dennis K. Clark lecture series, the 11th lecture series coin. So, old friend, it's a privilege for me to represent DK in awarding you this coin.
Well, thank you, Mike.
Yes, Mark, wonderful presentation, so timely and so great for our topic, is it not? It's wonderful. So,
You know, I have one thing to say.
okay,
It'd probably be an interesting evening for the discussion that's gonna take place between the language of the fan and the Indian Sign Language.
let's do a cross-section of that and see what happens. Anything could happen after that, let me tell you. Great job. Well, I guess, let's see, who do we have back here? I think what I'll do is just also at this point before we break, I'd like to also recognize that we have another organization that's doing important work, and that's the Smoky Hill Trail Association. And we have several members of that organization. It represents all the communities that exist along the Smoky Hill Trail, and that's an active group. And we have the president, I believe, there she is. Yeah, the president, the vice president, the secretary, and the treasurer? No. Yeah, yep. So, anyway, would Mike or anybody like to say anything about the Smoky Hill Trail Association and its work?
Madam President, you're up.
So, quick, Deb, so we can go have a break. Hurry up. And then recognize your board members.
Okay, obviously the Smoky Hill Trail is near and dear to us here. We, without that traffic on the trail, location. It's all about location. And the Smoky Hill Trail has an incredible history that has been somewhat eclipsed maybe by the Santa Fe Trail. But as we found out last year, they're very interconnected, and the Smoky Hill Trail has got its own legendary story to tell. So there's been efforts for years, long before I was involved, to mark that trail, which we hope to continue, and to increase the membership in the Trail Society, to get the trail recognized. That's one of the things we were talking about. There's a lot of recognition of national trails going on now, so that's one of the things that we're working toward. And the legal office for the trail will be relocated to the Fort Wallace Museum, which makes a lot of sense. It's been at Fort Hays State for a while, and which is nice, but it depends on who you've got working there at the time. But here we always have that connection to the trail, no matter who's here, whether it's me or Jane, or 50 years from now when our grandkids are running things. There will always be a connection here on the trail. So we would invite you to join. There will be they have a wonderful symposium in October, and so great newsletter, lots of good things and lots of good things to come. And so, yeah, we've got Marilyn here, and Mike, and who else? Sam. Yes, and Sam, and just so many people involved. Mark and Marla have been involved for years. So many people here. So Sam, and so we'd just love to have you join us and help. And Dennis Katzenmeyer and I were talking about all the things that all our organizations, the cattle trails, the Chisholm Trail, all us trail people and connected organizations can do to float the boat together, help each other with events, collaborate on things and raise awareness. So I think collaboration is a big thing. Yes, sir.
I might note that Sam and Norma Chestnut were two of the original group that started the Smoky Hill Trail Association, so thank you.
God bless you. Yes.
Do we have the board members standing right quick? Thank you very much.
Yeah, the board members that are here with the...
There you go. All right, great. Thank you very much.
Marilyn Copeland is now the treasurer.
Yeah. God bless you, Marilyn.
What really started off was we had Leo Alva give a presentation to our local historical society, and he said, one of the things he said is the Smoky Hill Trail is the forgotten trail. Somebody needs to do something about it, and it happened.
All right. That's our battle cry, isn't it? It's forgotten. Somebody's got to do something. So here we are. That's it.
Great job. Okay, let's have another 10-minute break. Don't have the last presentation. We're a little bit more relaxed on time, so we're doing all right. But let's get back in and we'll enjoy.
Let me say real quick,
Steve.
Harvey Pratt, his father-in-law passed away day before yesterday. So that's why Harvey's not joining us today, and he was really sad not to come. We were, looking at other options, but it didn't work. But hopefully we'll get Harvey up here sometime, because you will dearly love him. He's incredible with the Cheyenne Arapaho Nation, and an amazing man. So he's really sorry not to be here, so that's why he's not.
Take a break. We'll see you soon.